In the 1930s America, a phone call could mean death. A shadowy organization known as Murder Inc. turned contract killing into a business. With over 1,000 murders attributed to their name, they operated with ruthless efficiency. But who were the masterminds behind this deadly enterprise? How did they manage to evade justice for so long? This is the story of the Mafia's most notorious killing squad, and the relentless pursuit to bring them down. As the last drops of bootleg whiskey dried up with Prohibition's end, a new and more sinister enterprise took root in America's urban underbelly. The power vacuum left by bootleggers created an opportunity for a different breed of criminal, one that would make the speakeasy violence look tame by comparison. In the depths of the Great Depression, while legitimate businesses crumbled and breadlines stretched for blocks, a group of men saw opportunity in the chaos. Exploiting the economic desperation, they built an empire not on liquor or gambling, but on death itself. The founders of Murder Inc. were cunning businessmen with a twisted sense of entrepreneurship. Louis Lepke Buchalter led the operation, his ruthlessness matched only by his business acumen. Beside him stood Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, whose dead eyes and steady trigger finger made him the perfect enforcer. Their first high-profile hit sent shockwaves through both the underworld and law enforcement. On a crisp October morning in 1935, Dutch Schultz, once king of the Bronx rackets, was gunned down in a Newark chop house. The murder was a masterclass in efficiency and brutality, signaling that Murder Inc. was open for business and no one was beyond their reach. The organization's structure mirrored that of a corporation, with a clear chain of command and specialized roles. Buchalter and Anastasia served as the CEOs, overseeing a board of directors comprised of high-ranking mobsters who decided which contracts to accept. Below them, men like Abe, Kid Twist, Reles, and Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss managed operations and assigned hits to the foot soldiers, the actual triggermen. Murder Inc. reach extended far beyond New York, with operatives in major cities across the country. This nationwide network allowed them to carry out hits with coordination and efficiency that local law enforcement struggled to combat. Their methods were as varied as they were brutal. Some victims were gunned down in broad daylight, while others disappeared without a trace, their bodies dissolved in acid or buried in remote locations. The killers prided themselves on adaptability, making murders look like accidents, suicides, or robberies gone wrong. This efficiency and discretion quickly made Murder Inc. as the go-to option for mob bosses seeking to eliminate rivals or silence witnesses. No job was too big or small, from low-level bookies to high-ranking politicians threatening to expose corruption. As their influence grew, so did the body count. Conservative estimates put their murders at around 400, but some investigators believe the true figure could be closer to 1,000. Each killing expanded their reputation and client base. The rise of Murder Inc. marked the beginning of an unprecedented era of organized crime in America. They had created a national network of killers, a deadly web stretching from coast to coast, forever changing the landscape of American criminal enterprise. A ringing phone in a Brooklyn candy store could trigger a death sentence miles away. This seemingly innocent signal set in motion a chilling sequence of events, orchestrated by Murder Inc., America's most efficient killing machine. They weren't just thugs, they were a corporation dedicated to the business of death. Murder Inc. operated with clockwork precision, transforming murder into a cold, calculated enterprise. Each hit required meticulous planning, from initial surveillance to weapon selection. Their operatives were professionals, treating contracts like high-stakes business deals. To discuss their grim trade without arousing suspicion, the group developed a coded language. Merchandise meant victims, while contracts were murder assignments. In a bustling diner, two men might casually discuss delivering a package to Pittsburgh, their mundane words masking plans for an out-of-state hit. Hitmen were chosen based on their specific skills. Some excelled at close-range kills, others were marksmen. This approach mirrored any large corporation, with human resources carefully matched to each project's needs. Murder Inc. favored methods that could be mistaken for accidents or natural causes. Ice picks left small puncture wounds easily overlooked by coroners. Rope allowed hitmen to stage suicides or accidents. When a more dramatic statement was needed, they weren't above using explosives or firearms. The organization maintained strict rules about killing civilians and interfering with legitimate businesses. These weren't moral considerations, but practical ones. Civilian deaths attracted unwanted attention, while disrupting legitimate enterprises could harm the Mafia's own interests. Their efficiency was matched only by their brutality. Some murders were designed to send a message, serving as gruesome warnings. Bodies would be found mutilated, tortured, or displayed in public places. These killings were advertisements for Murder, Inc.'s services, and a demonstration of the consequences of defying the mob. Murder, Inc. turned everyday locations into staging grounds for death. A bustling hotel lobby could become an execution site. A quiet park might serve as a dumping ground for bodies. This blending of the mundane and the macabre added an extra layer of terror to their operations. No place was truly safe. The organization's reach extended far beyond New York. They had operatives in major cities across the United States, allowing them to carry out hits anywhere in the country. This nationwide network of killers was unprecedented, turning Murder, Inc. into a truly national threat. As their reputation grew, so did the fear they instilled in both the criminal underworld and law-abiding citizens. The mere whisper of Murder, Inc.'s involvement was often enough to ensure compliance. They had become more than just killers. They were the boogeyman of the American underworld. In a world where loose lips sank ships, Murder, Inc. built an empire on silence. Their code, known as Omerta, wasn't just a rule, it was a way of life. But as the organization's tentacles spread across America, keeping secrets became a Herculean task. The foundation of Murder, Inc.'s secrecy was a complex system of compartmentalization. Information flowed on a need-to-know basis, creating a labyrinth of isolated cells. Each hitman knew only what was necessary for their specific job, nothing more. This strategy ensured that if one member was caught, they couldn't bring down the entire organization. Initiation into Murder, Inc. was a brutal affair designed to test loyalty and resolve. Prospective members faced a series of escalating challenges, each more morally compromising than the last. These tests ranged from minor crimes to participating in murders. The process served a dual purpose, weeding out the weak-willed and creating a shared experience of complicity that bound members together. One former member, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the final test. "They handed me a gun and pointed to a guy tied up in the corner. They said, 'It's him or you.' I didn't even know who he was, but I knew I had no choice. That's how they got you. Once you pulled that trigger, you were one of them forever." But loyalty born of fear is a fragile thing. Murder, Inc. understood this and employed a sophisticated system of carrots and sticks to keep their members in line. Generous payouts and protection from rival gangs rewarded faithful service. For those who wavered, the threat of violence loomed large, not just against them, but against their families. Family members of hitmen were often kept in the dark about their loved ones' true occupations. This ignorance served as both protection and leverage. Wives believed their husbands were salesmen or businessmen, their frequent travels explained away as work trips. Children grew up never suspecting that their father's briefcases contained more than paperwork. To further insulate themselves, Murder, Inc. cultivated a network of corrupt officials. Judges, police officers, and politicians were brought into the fold through a combination of bribery and blackmail. This web of corruption provided protection from law enforcement and early warnings of potential threats. A former NYPD detective, who spent years investigating Murder, Inc., explained the extent of the corruption. "We'd plan a raid, and somehow they always knew we were coming. It took us years to realize the leak was coming from inside our own precinct. By the time we figured it out, half the force was on their payroll." Despite these precautions, cracks in the wall of silence were beginning to form. The sheer scale of Murder, Inc. operations made it increasingly difficult to maintain absolute secrecy. As the body count rose, so did public outrage and law enforcement scrutiny. The facade of Murder, Inc.'s impenetrable silence began to crack. As the bodies piled up across America, so did the evidence. Law enforcement agencies, once baffled by seemingly unrelated killings, started to see patterns emerge. The first thread in the unraveling of America's most feared killing machine was about to be pulled. In the summer of 1940, a low-level member of Murder, Inc. named Harry Rudolph was arrested for a petty crime. What seemed like a routine bust would prove to be the turning point in the war against organized crime. Rudolph, facing a lengthy prison sentence, made a decision that would send shockwaves through the underworld. He decided to talk. Detective Abraham Levine, a veteran of the New York Police Department, recalled the moment Rudolph began to sing. "It was like a dam breaking," Levine said. "Once he started, the information just kept flowing. Names, dates, locations. He gave us everything." Rudolph's testimony provided investigators with their first real glimpse into the inner workings of Murder, Inc. He revealed a complex hierarchy, with each level carefully insulated from the others. At the top sat the board of directors, shadowy figures who never got their hands dirty. Below them were the managers, men like Abe "Kid Twist" Reelis, who coordinated the day-to-day operations. At the bottom were the triggermen, the cold-blooded killers who carried out the contracts. Armed with this new information, law enforcement agencies across the country began to coordinate their efforts. The FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, took a keen interest in the case. Hoover saw Murder, Inc. as a threat to national security and allocated significant resources to bringing it down. One of the most effective tools in the fight against Murder, Inc. was the wiretap. Agents planted listening devices in known hangouts of suspected members. The conversations they recorded were chilling in their casualness. Murder was discussed as casually as the weather. In one particularly disturbing exchange, two members of Murder, Inc. were overheard discussing an upcoming hit. "Make sure you use the ice pick," one said. "It's cleaner that way." The other replied, "No problem. I'll make it look like a robbery gone wrong." As the net tightened, even the most hardened killers began to feel the pressure. Paranoia set in. Members of Murder, Inc. began to suspect each other of being informants. The once tight bonds of loyalty began to fray. The media, sensing a big story, began to pay attention. Headlines screamed about the syndicate of death operating in America's cities. Public outrage grew, putting additional pressure on law enforcement to bring Murder, Inc. to justice. In response to the growing threat, Murder, Inc. began to make mistakes. A series of high-profile murders drew unwanted attention. In one case, a prominent businessman was gunned down in broad daylight on a busy New York street. Witnesses described the killer as cold as ice, walking away from the scene without a hint of remorse. As the investigation progressed, investigators began to piece together the full scope of Murder, Inc.'s operations. They discovered a network that stretched far beyond New York, with tentacles reaching into cities across the country. Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, no major urban center was untouched by their influence. The organization's reach extended into the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Corrupt officials were on the payroll, providing protection and tipping off the syndicate to upcoming raids. This web of corruption made the task of bringing down Murder, Inc. even more challenging. But as more members of the organization began to talk, the wall of silence crumbled. One by one, key players were arrested and charged. The once mighty Murder, Inc. began to collapse under its own weight. Former prosecutor Burton Turkus, who would later write a book about the case, described the final days of the investigation. "It was like watching a house of cards fall," Turkus said. "Once we got that first confession, everything else followed." These men, who had thought themselves untouchable, were suddenly facing the reality of life behind bars, or worse. The fall of Murder, Inc. left a gaping wound in the criminal underworld. As the dust settled on the organization's collapse, a new and unexpected chapter in America's criminal history began to unfold. The power vacuum created by the dismantling of this deadly enterprise sparked a wave of violence that rippled through the nation's cities. Former members of Murder, Inc., now facing the prospect of lengthy prison sentences, or worse, began to turn on one another. The code of silence that had protected the organization for years crumbled under the weight of self-preservation. As these hardened criminals vied for leniency, they spilled long-held secrets, implicating associates in decades-old murders. Detective James Tobin, who had spent years investigating Murder, Inc., described the aftermath as a powder keg waiting to explode. He recalled, "We'd get calls daily about bodies turning up in alleys, abandoned buildings, even in broad daylight on busy streets. It was like the ghosts of Murder, Inc. were settling old scores. As the body count rose, so did the number of cold cases suddenly linked to the fallen organization. Families who had long given up hope of finding answers about their missing loved ones found themselves thrust back into a world of uncertainty and grief. Margaret Sinclair, whose brother disappeared in 1937, recounted her experience. "After all those years, a detective showed up at my door. He said they had new information about Tommy's case. I didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. It was like losing him all over again." Law enforcement agencies across the country found themselves overwhelmed by the influx of new leads and confessions. The techniques developed to investigate Murder, Inc. were now being applied to a backlog of unsolved crimes stretching back decades. FBI agent Robert Carson, who led several of these reinvestigated cases, noted the challenges they faced. "We were dealing with crime scenes that were long gone, witnesses who had passed away, and evidence that had degraded or been lost. It was like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing." Despite these obstacles, some families finally found closure. In Chicago, the remains of 3 victims were discovered in a long-abandoned warehouse, their deaths linked to a Murder, Inc. hit from 1939. In Los Angeles, a retired hitman confessed to 4 murders on his deathbed, providing details that only the killer could have known. However, for every solved case, dozens more remain shrouded in mystery. The true extent of Murder, Inc.'s reign of terror may never be fully known. Criminologist Dr. Emily Hartman estimates that there could be hundreds of unsolved murders potentially linked to Murder, Inc. that remain mysteries today. The legacy of Murder, Inc. extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of its fall. The organization's brutal efficiency and business-like approach to murder influenced future criminal enterprises. Law enforcement agencies, recognizing the sophisticated nature of this new breed of organized crime, developed new strategies to combat similar organizations. Former FBI Director William Webster reflected on this shift in approach. "Murder, Inc. taught us that we couldn't rely on old methods to fight new threats. We had to become as organized and methodical as the criminals we were pursuing." The legend of Murder, Inc. also seeped into popular culture, often romanticized in films, books, and television shows. This glamorization of their brutal efficiency caused concern among law enforcement officials and victims' advocates. Sarah Jennings, founder of a support group for families of Murder, Inc. victims, expressed her frustration. "These weren't romantic figures or anti-heroes, they were cold-blooded killers who destroyed countless lives. We can't let their crimes be forgotten or, worse, celebrated." Despite efforts to mythologize Murder, Inc., the reality of their actions continues to haunt those affected by their crimes. The organization's fall may have marked the end of an era in organized crime, but its impact continues to reverberate through American society. The story of Murder, Inc. reveals a dark chapter in American history, one that continues to cast a long shadow. As former FBI Director William Webster noted, Murder, Inc. taught us that to combat organized crime, we had to become just as organized. This lesson reshaped law enforcement strategies for decades to come. Yet, the human cost of Murder, Inc. cannot be forgotten. Sarah Jennings, founder of a support group for families of Murder, Inc.'s victims, reminds us these weren't romantic figures. They were cold-blooded killers who destroyed lives. Her words echo the pain that still lingers for many. The legacy of Murder, Inc. serves as a stark reminder of the dangers when criminal enterprises are allowed to flourish unchecked. It underscores the need for constant vigilance against corruption and the importance of a robust justice system. As we look back on this era, we must remain alert to the conditions that allow such organizations to take root, ensuring that history does not repeat itself. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment about what other topics we should cover. See you next time.